Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are excited to continue our webinar series that we love to post these videos on YouTube for you all to watch on demand. Today, I am joined with Dr. Kathleen Bogart, who I have known for a long time and followed your work for quite some time, but I had the pleasure of meeting this July at the Moebius Syndrome Foundation conference. And as I was just saying, I was just blown away at this conference. The quality of research presented, the symposium sessions, and just obviously the amazing personality and love of the people that I met really made an impact on me. And so it is so great to be able to join with the Moebius Syndrome Foundation in co-presenting this webinar. Dr. Bogart was kind enough to do a session there, and I thought that there is no better thing to share with our families during Craniofacial Acceptance Month than this very timely topic, disclosing facial differences. So thank you, Dr. Bogart, for sharing this with us. And with that, I'll turn it over to you to let you introduce yourself and present what you have found.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and Erica. It was lovely to get to finally meet you in person at the Moebius Syndrome Foundation conference. And you were part of an excellent panel of different facial difference organizations working together. So I think that is a lovely theme that will be kind of captured a bit in the talk that I give today. So just by way of background, I'm an associate professor of psychology at Oregon State University, and my research and teaching and scholarship all focus on disability and facial difference. And that really stems from some of my own personal experiences being born with Moebius syndrome and growing up with a facial difference. So today I'm going to try to answer or start to answer an age-old question in the facial difference world: to explain or not to explain your condition, right? I think most people have experienced the feeling of kind of it looming as an elephant in the room, where people might notice, they might be curious, and people wonder if they should address it or leave it alone. So today we're going to learn about how people address their facial difference and explaining it, and what they do in different circumstances, which approaches are associated with better outcomes and with better mental health. And as I was mentioning, I think it's really helpful to think about our facial difference community as a broad group, not just focusing on, one specific condition. And that's why I was so happy to see the panel at the Moebius Syndrome Foundation conference, bringing together leaders from different facial difference organizations. So let's define facial difference for a minute. So facial differences include any disorders or injuries that affect the appearance, structure, or movement of the face. And there are a whole bunch of different ones, but there are some common themes and common dimensions across all of the facial differences. So one dimension is whether it is congenital or acquired. For example, my condition, Moebius syndrome, is a congenital facial paralysis condition. Cleft lip and palate and birthmarks are also conditions that people are born with, whereas people can acquire a facial difference later in life due to burns or cancer or injuries. Facial differences also vary on how common or rare they are. So again, using the example of burns, those are relatively common. So are cleft lip and palates. Moebius syndrome and conditions like Treacher-Collins syndrome are rare. And then they also vary in their concealability. Some facial differences are somewhat concealable. Maybe a skin condition could be covered with makeup, or a birthmark might be covered with hair. On the other hand, conditions that involve a large part of the face, like many craniofacial differences, are hard to conceal. I think my condition, Moebius syndrome, at least for me, is a good example of that. So I'm going to tell you about two studies that I did with the facial difference community today. These two studies were funded by the Moebius Syndrome Foundation. And the first study was kind of a first foray into learning from people with a variety of facial differences about their experiences choosing to disclose or not disclose their facial difference. So we included 6 people with Moebius syndrome, as well as people with a variety of other syndromes that were congenital and acquired, common and rare, concealable and not. And we interviewed these individuals one-on-one, and overall came up with kind of a spectrum of disclosure styles that people had experienced throughout their lifetimes. And I'm going to summarize them here, and then in the following slides, take a deep dive into each one. So the first disclosure style was compelled disclosure or compelled non-disclosure. This is where people felt like they were forced or trapped into saying something about their facial difference or not saying something about it. Next was autonomous non-disclosure. So this is where people felt that they were in control of the situation and they chose not to disclose. And then finally, we have open disclosure, and this is where people chose to openly discuss their facial difference. So I want to talk about some examples of each type of disclosure. So starting with forced disclosure, here's a quote from a participant. And something I should mention is that all of these names are pseudonyms. They're not the real names of people, but we wanted to humanize them by giving them names. So this person we call Maria, and she said, I was getting gas filled up. You have to have your window down to talk to the attendant. He had the tank thingy in my car. I couldn't just drive off. I was totally trapped while he told me his friend was in a motorcycle accident and looked just like me. And so Maria went on to say that she felt that the person was forcing her to tell him what had happened to her. And in her case, she was born with her facial difference. She did not acquire it from an injury and felt that that was applying kind of a traumatic experience to her otherwise just a way that she had been born. So now here's an example of forced non-disclosure. Again, this is from Maria, and she said she's also been given lots of quote-unquote advice on how to quote-unquote fix my face, like wear more makeup, and have you considered surgery when I have had many. So here she was feeling that others were strongly telling her, forcing her that she should try to hide or minimize her facial difference. And here's a quote from John about unauthorized disclosure. So he was at a bar and he had recently acquired Bell's palsy. He didn't want other people he knew to know about his Bell's palsy, but he said as soon as he got there, he heard her say to someone across the room, "Oh, it's true," and then they looked at his face. So they had heard about him through the grapevine, and his reaction was, "Oh my God, they know, everyone knows that now." And then I want to share an example of avoidance. So in this example, Roman really didn't like the way his new face looked. He had recently been experienced a facial difference because of facial cancer. And so he ended up going to a community college in hopes that no one would recognize him because it was an hour away from where he was from. And then finally, there is concealment within our theme of forced disclosure or non-disclosure. Here, people actually, this might relate to a lot of people might relate to this. So during the pandemic, Alex said the pandemic for me has been like a blessing in the sense because I had my mask on, people don't ask me what's that thing on my face. It's like lifting up an anxiety that I have felt my entire life. Right. So for many of us, a mask concealed some or all of our facial difference, and in that sense, did not require a disclosure in those moments. Now I want to talk about autonomous non-disclosure, a way that people would sometimes go about choosing not to disclose involved actually giving a confabulated statement about what caused their facial difference. So in this case, Alex was at a cafe and the server came up to us and he asked, "Oh my God, what happened to your face?" And Alex said, "It's from a fire that burned down the orphanage that I grew up in." Everyone paused and I said, "I'm just kidding. It's a birthmark, but why do you ask?" And she said that I seek to make the situation uncomfortable so that people can feel how uncomfortable it is for me. And then people also would engage in what we called selective disclosure. So Stephen with Moebius Syndrome said that disclosing is a layer of myself that I open up to friends and family who I really trust. You're making an investment of trust with a friend or a loved one that is being paid in kind by more trust from that person. And then finally, I'll talk about the two open disclosure strategies. So the first was indiscriminate disclosure. And Katie took this approach when she was on dating sites. She said, I basically have a profile that says, like, this is me, you know, this is what you get. She put up a clear picture of her face, and it was apparent that she had a facial difference. And she said, I don't want to be with anyone who's freaked out by that anyway. I don't want to be with someone who is superficial. And then taking it one step further, some people engaged in what we call broadcasting, which meant openly discussing your facial difference as with the goal of educating the public or reducing stigma at a social level. So here's a really good quote that illustrates that. Cecilia said, "God made me this way as a part of his mission, his own little part in helping with craniofacial awareness, to teach everyone about how diversity can be beautiful." So those were the main themes that we found when we talked with our 16 adults with facial differences. We really appreciated the opportunity to have these detailed, hour-long conversations with individuals like this. However, if you're thinking like I'm thinking, 16 people is not enough to tell us if we have actually captured all of the potential disclosure experiences that are common. So we want to follow this up with a large-scale study in which we recruited 288 adults with facial differences. 33 different facial differences were ultimately represented, and people were from 18 different countries. Most of them were from the US or the UK. And we presented them summaries of the disclosure styles that I just described to you. And we also collected other information about the percentage of people they had disclosed to, whether they had additional disclosure styles to add to our list. And we used established scales to measure mental health and job and relationship satisfaction, and we would then be able to link that to disclosure approaches. So to jump to the findings here, we found that overall, participants reported disclosing to 59% of the people that they knew, so a little more than half. And we define disclosure here as acknowledging, discussing, or explaining a facial difference. Then we also asked what approaches, if any, they used with an employer. And we saw that 59% used open disclosure and told their employer about their facial difference. We asked about the timing of this, and most did so when they were working there for a while, which indicates they wanted to be sure that they felt safe in making that disclosure. And we also asked about disclosure to a partner, and we found that an overwhelming 90% used open disclosure, and this usually occurred before or at the beginning of a relationship starting. And you should see a familiar slide here. We asked again for people to say if they had used these disclosure styles before and how frequently. So we found that all of these disclosure styles were represented. No new ones really appeared. And we found that the most commonly used ones were selective disclosure and indiscriminate disclosure. And then we also asked people what their most recommended styles were if they were to give someone else advice. And you saw the same two, selective disclosure and indiscriminate disclosure listed. But there is also an addition. People did not as frequently use broadcasting, but they recommended it. So that's an interesting finding, which suggests it's kind of an aspirational thing that people would like to use more. And then, as promised, we associated disclosure approaches with real-world outcomes, and we found that of all three disclosure styles, open disclosure was associated with the best outcomes, including better mental health, lower stigma, higher self-esteem, higher job satisfaction, and more confidence in relationships. So to return to that age-old question of to explain or not to explain, we can now see that compelled disclosure is felt to be harmful by participants, and it should be avoided, right? So people feel very uncomfortable with being forced to disclose or not to disclose. And this presents kind of an interesting paradox. It means that parents often wonder if they should disclose for their child or do some education and advocacy work. But now we know that it's harmful to force someone to disclose or to disclose for them. So what this means is that as soon as the child is able to engage in these conversations, the parent should involve their child in decisions around when and how and if to disclose. So we can see that openly disclosing can be a way to take control over a situation and preempt misunderstanding. So it does suggest that people may want to proactively disclose before they feel forced to. The biggest take home here is that social level stigma reduction is needed so that people are not walking around being forced to disclose or feeling like they have to. If there were better representation of facial differences in our communities and in our media, it would not be unusual to see someone with a facial difference, and it wouldn't cause as much novelty and curiosity. So our findings do suggest that open disclosure is healthy So people may want to consider explaining to others who are going to play an important role in their lives. So this could include potential friends, family members. We have an example that was shared by a participant, actually. She had tried a number of different approaches in terms of whether or not to address her facial differences during job interviews. And she read some advice from the organization Changing Faces, which is a UK facial difference organization. And that advice suggests to consider disclosing before a job interview, like after you're invited, but before you go, or at the very beginning of the interview. And so doing this kind of upfront allows the people in the room to start to understand and process the facial difference and then move on, so that they are then able to focus on the content of what you're saying and your qualifications. And this participant actually found this approach to work the best for her. So for many people, it can feel uncomfortable to start disclosing. So one way to build disclosure confidence is to prepare a few simple sentences that you might use in different situations, what you might say in a job interview versus to a friend or to someone you're interested in romantically. And also just practicing disclosing and talking openly about your condition more when you're around your family and friends. And likewise, family and friends can support people with facial differences by having those open conversations and taking away the taboo that can be around discussions of facial difference. So I want to thank you very much for attending this webinar. Again, I want to thank the Moebius Syndrome Foundation for their funding and to CCA for hosting. And if you'd like to learn more about this research, you're welcome to check out the QR code here with all my links. Email me. I also write about these topics for Psychology Today, so you can check out my blog, Disability is Diversity. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. I have so much to say and so much that I think about ever since you presented this. One of the things I love the most, and I really think is a takeaway, especially for parents out there, is how you categorize the forms of disclosure and non-disclosure. And because I'm sure many of us have experienced a lot of those. For example, forced disclosure, that's played a part in my life, or unauthorized, there we go, unauthorized disclosure, someone telling other people about me before I show up. Or another one, a lot of times you get an advice about the false disclosure. Tell them a story like, you beat somebody up and you should see the other guy. So I think having words to describe what those phenomenon or those common things are in our life is so helpful to me, because I can look back on my experiences and say, oh, that's an example of, compelled disclosure. Now I understand what I was experiencing. And I think, again, parents can use that for their children and say, we want you to be comfortable with open disclosure. We don't ever want to do this on your behalf if you're uncomfortable with it. And just having those understanding that there's different types has been so powerful to me. And I think it can really be used to understand the journey better by our families too. So that really,
thank you. Yeah, I think that part has been very helpful for me too, to have that vocabulary, that language to put into those experiences. And the few times I've presented this work already, like at the Moebius Syndrome Conference, I've had people come up to me afterwards and say, well, I used to, be a concealer, but now I'm a broadcaster, So it's so interesting to see how people can pick up that language and use it to understand their own journeys.
Yeah. Do you have any plans to do more with putting that language out there or using it as a teaching tool? Is there any plan to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have written up, a summary of what we've learned so far on that Psychology Today blog. And our next steps are to interview teenagers about their experiences, because we know that that can be a very challenging time in anyone's life, especially if you have a facial difference. And it's a time when we're going through a lot of identity shifts, and also maybe kind of having to explain ourselves for the first time, maybe when we apply for a job or when we start dating, right? So I think that's a really important time. And although the adults that we talked to could remember what it was like as a teenager, I think it's totally different to talk to people who are in the middle of that experience and of a different generation.
Definitely. And that's super timely. We'll be happy to share when you start recruiting for that study, because we have found over the summer that our teens have so much to say and they have so much that they want to share with our community. So I'm really excited that you are going to be interviewing them as well and polling them. Another thing that I think we would love to continue the conversation at some point is how the parents are involved in sharing young children's stories. And have you gathered any advice from anyone in the community on that? How parents should go about it, since they are also experiencing, time off of work and having to kind of maybe pull back from social commitments in the early stages? Does that require, or maybe my question is, they're going to be forced to give some explanation, and how does that fit into giving a child agency with their own disclosure?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that also points to kind of our second main goal when we extend this research, is to also interview parents about their experiences, because we know what you said is very common, right? So there will be situations where parents will need to disclose at least some amount of information to, as you said, get off of work. They will be asked questions about their children. Often, if it's a congenital condition, they'll be asked when they're babies. And all of those can present kind of a surprising situation for a parent if they're not prepared for it. So I do think that hearing from parents, kind of getting some strategies, can then help parents of younger kids kind of prepare for this sort of thing.
Definitely. I think that's a wonderful continuation of this work as well. And I remember from the session that you did at the Moebius Syndrome Foundation conference, that someone said something that stuck out to me, and they said, in that process of rehearsing those simple disclosure statements, what people are looking for is reassurance and that you're okay. And that has stuck out to me so much, because when you're preparing those words, whether it's a job interview or children on a playground, everybody's just looking for reassurance that you're capable and wanting to do the job, or that the child isn't hurting. So I think that was something that I thought, that audience member really hit the nail on the head when they said, make sure your disclosure statement is a little bit a little bit serving the other person with that reassurance.
I agree. I think that really is kind of the thing that underlies a lot of the wondering that people do about facial difference. It's, is this person okay? I've heard, you know, in the Moebius syndrome community, children, their friends will ask them, are you sick? Do you have cancer? Are you going to die? And with our community, that's certainly not a concern. We have normal lifespans and are generally healthy, so it just goes to show the level of misconceptions that can exist because there isn't good awareness of facial differences. And it also shows that people care, right? People want to know that you're going to be okay. So I think that was such a nice tip to have that simple explanation. I have a facial difference. I was born with it. Don't worry, I'm okay now.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, I love that. Well, I could probably go on and on, but I think since this is definitely an on-demand webinar, I encourage people who are watching to read your blog, contact you in the methods that you provided, and just keep this conversation going. I love that we are learning. I love that we're able to do better for the next generation and do better for ourselves as we learn these words, these vocabulary, and what leads to better outcomes. So I'm very grateful also to the Moebius Syndrome Foundation for funding this work, and for Jenny Whitman for helping us get set up and allow this to happen. So this has been another wonderful conversation, and I just thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was lovely.
Wonderful. Well, with that, I will sign us off. Thanks everyone for watching.